know that moment when you finish a game and you just stare at the credits with an empty feeling, thinking of what should you do with your life now? I want you to take that feeling, multiply it by 10, and that's how it feels like after you go back to work after a relaxing holiday. Being an adult sucks. Now I want you to go further and take that feeling multiplied by 100, and that's how it feels like finishing Shadow of the Erdtree, knowing that no Souls-like content is coming from FromSoftware in the near future. Now don't get me wrong, going back to games such as Dave the Diver or Slay the Spire is a good palate cleanser for the mind and soul, but soon you will start craving that run back only for your 20th attempt to be worse than your first one. And I know there are other options to quench your thirst out there, but not enough Hollow Knight, Blasphemous or Lies of P will scratch that itch, despite all of them being masterpieces in their own right. It's like trying to switch to cocaine from meth. It's not the same, but there is still a kick. There is just something that FromSoftware adds to their games, and I can never put my finger on exactly what it is. Lies of P has the polish and the gameplay versatility. Blasphemous has the atmosphere and the bosses, and Hollow Knight? Well, Hollow Knight has all of the above. That being said, I often crave replaying the Souls series more than any of the previously mentioned games or any recent Souls-like. And you can guess from the title of this video what is my go-to when it comes to that. Now, do you remember the empty feeling I was talking about earlier? I want you to take that, multiplied by 1,000, and that's the feeling you get when you finish your first Souls game. Quick disclaimer, I had to mention the fact that Dark Souls 3 was my introduction to the series because I feel like the game you start with becomes a core memory for most people that is hard to not have a biased opinion on. That being said, I will try my best to be as objective as possible when it comes to critiquing the lesser aspects of the game. Matter of fact, I think it's better if we start there. The main criticisms of Dark Souls 3 is how linear it is compared to its predecessors, especially Dark Souls 1. I mean, the first half of Dark Souls 1 is notorious for being peak level design. You have the original Firelink Shrine, which is the main hub where multiple shortcuts link back to, as well as being connected to different areas of the game, offering the player a choice of which wrong area to explore before you choose the correct one. Yeah, that's how I view this shit. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think the interconnectivity of these areas is so well thought and adds to the immersion of a believable world, but if it comes at the detriment of a new player that goes to the catacombs, gets gangbanged by skeletons, then quits the game forever, maybe it's not that flawless as it is hyped of being. On the other hand, yes, the world of Dark Souls 3 is really linear, and to put that into perspective, Dark Souls 1 is like the McDonald's playground with the interlocking tubes and shit, and Dark Souls 3 is like a hallway with like some rooms you can go into, but it is just a straight hallway. And Dark Souls 2 is like a Scooby-Doo hallway where you enter a door to find yourself climbing a windmill just to end up in hell, and that's why I love Dark Souls 2, but that's a topic for another time. The structure of Dark Souls 3 allows its levels to flow into each other effortlessly. You start in a castle, you move your way down to a village, then you're in the woods, which becomes a swamp. You dive deep in some catacombs just so you can emerge into gorgeous ass Irithyll, or take a vacation in what is essentially the remains of Lost Izalith. Back in Irithyll, you can delve into a sex dungeon or climb your way up to fucking Orlando just so you can get teleported back where you started. As a side note, let me address this aspect here as it is often brought up in the discourse surrounding Dark Souls 3. The level of fan service here is tasteful, it is not cheap or lazy, and it doesn't exploit nostalgia. It is a love letter to the origins of the trilogy and a symbolic send-off. Moving on, On paper, yes, it is really not that deep, but in execution, I think the linear progression helps with the engagement of the player as well as the pacing of the game by offering the player a gradual learning curve with no drastic difficulty spikes, leading to a uniform progression. When it comes to world building, you also have the expected variety of areas that you are used to from FromSoftware at this point. You have the cold place and the hot place, the dark dungeon and the bright mountaintop, the annoying library and the obvious swamp level. Only this time it is not that annoying to traverse, and if you're not interested in exploring it, you can skip it really quick. But despite reusing the same concepts from previous games, the enemy placement gives identity to these areas, making them stand out. One good example is the ballista from the smoldering lake that elevates a rather empty area. Oh yeah, and what's left of Solaire. The winged knights of Lothric, the goat cons from Farron Keep, and the jailer cons from Irithyll Dungeon are some other examples of how Dark Souls 3 shines at world building through its enemy variety and placement. Oh yeah, and the Silver Knights from An Orlando, I bet you won't forget them anytime soon. The areas blend together harmoniously, and even though I wish we would have had some of the wackiness that is the world design of Dark Souls 2, DS3 manages to create a homogeneous picture in a world that makes sense by mixing all these intricate and dense areas such as Cathedral of the Deep, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, and the fucking past version of Firelink Shrine. Okay, forget about making sense, Dark Souls 2 is alive and well here. What's missing here though from Dark Souls 2 is the color grading that made Majula and Dragoniri pop. Despite the concentrated brown that is ever so present here, DS3 still manages to have impressive vistas and stunning areas. Just look at this desktop material shit. As I mentioned earlier, when it comes to pacing, I believe that Dark Souls 3 is king. Most people take pacing for granted and don't understand how important a well-paced experience is detrimental to their enjoyment, and how multiple segments pieced together hazardously, even if they're good on their own, can ruin any build-up and lead the player to get bored or burnt out. Through its linearity, Dark Souls 3 is able to control its pacing for a slower build-up in the first half that quickly ramps up in the second half, leading to an unforgettable crescendo at the end. You have windows to take a breather after a difficult fight, as well as peak fight after peak fight towards the end of the game when the adrenaline is at its highest and you know shit is about to go down. By having a controlled and carefully built structure, the game allows the player to digest everything naturally and not be starved or force-fed content. To give a counter-example, jumping back to what is actually terrible world design and pacing, that being the second half of Dark Souls 1. Congratulations, you have just beat peak gank boss design and you can finally teleport. Side note, hopefully you didn't go to Lost Isolith after Quelaag or brute force your way through the depths and Tomb of the Giants. As if the game didn't organically push you towards these areas just so you can find piss doors taking the piss out of you and forcing you to backtrack. You get the Lord Vessel and now the game becomes an incoherent to-do list where you teleport all over the place to kill whatever big boy stands in your way to Gwen, and the flawless pacing of the first half goes out the window. I'm sorry, I hate the second half of Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 3 gives you the ability to fast travel from the start, and yet by focusing on creating a structured and organic progression of the levels, you don't have to abuse this mechanic and ruin the pacing of this great adventure. You might want to go back to upgrade or level up or look for shit that you might have missed, but you can go pretty much from point A to point Z with no interruptions. If linearity can create masterpieces such as Uncharted and Bioshock when used for its advantage of compressing all the good shit into one cohesive roller coaster ride, why do people don't give the same credit to Dark Souls 3 when it does the same thing just because its predecessor managed to somehow create an impressive interconnected world that is also somewhat broken? This logic is flawed because from now on we will always live in a post-Elden Ring world where the game has completely mastered the open world design by having the exploration take center stage as the natural progression. That being said, if we are going to compare future Souls-like to the ridiculously high and unrealistic standards of Elden Ring, the genre might as well die because only Elden Ring 2, if it ever comes out, might surpass that. Every new addition to the genre needs to be treated with the same respect for its own scope and creative vision. just like Lies of P. Lies of P is an experience even more linear than DS3, but look at how, by creating said linear and condensed experience, the developers were able to focus their attention on creating what is arguably one of the best weapon systems in any game, period, that can shine from one end of the hallway to the other, due to the diversity that it brings to the combat. Speaking of combat and diversity, another major complaint I see in the discourse surrounding Dark Souls 3 is how spamming R1 is the meta and arguably the most efficient way to approach the combat, resulting in a pretty monotone fighting style void of variety, and I'm talking exclusively about melee here, I'm not including magic. And to that I have to say that that is completely wrong. The most broken way to beat the game is actually spamming L1 with the twin blades because they shred through everything like butter. I mean, look at this shit, it's fucking broken. And you start the game with them. Okay, for real now, I don't really have a counter argument for the state of the melee combat because it is actually quite true. Once you get yourself any type of weapon, but especially a straight sword, you can pretty much just go to town on that R1 button and there is actually no incentive for you to go for charge attacks like in Bloodborne, and you don't have the ability to power stance like in Dark Souls 2. The worst comparison by far is Elden Ring, because when you return to Lothric from the lands between, you really start to miss the jump attacks, the stagger system, the Ashes of War, and how much the combat has evolved, giving you so many approaches to defeating your foes. That being said, despite all of the improvements made regarding the combat system the series would make in the future, ironically I believe that by simplifying the combat, Dark Souls 3 created the best quote-unquote dance the series has ever seen. If you are not a fan of the series, the dance I'm referring to is the interaction between the player and the enemies. The timing of the dodges, the windows for attacking or healing, and every quick response to whatever the boss is doing creates the dance. I will talk about the bosses more in depth in a later segment, but I think it's funny on how Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro are almost unanimously considered to have the best bosses in the series, and I believe it is because of how fluid the dance is, despite having the most simplistic combat systems in the series, especially Sekiro. In Sekiro, despite having your shinobi prosthetics and learning a couple of new moves throughout the game, your katana and its basic moveset is what you get from the beginning to the end. And yet, through this simplicity, the game achieves an amazing rhythm that gets the player locked in and having fun going through the natural motions of the dance. Considering that, it's not a surprise that Sekiro followed immediately after DS3, sharing the same simplicity, because I think FromSoftware decided to explore further that style of gameplay whilst focusing its main resources on upgrading the combat systems with Elden Ring. That might be a stretch, but what I'm trying to say is that we don't have Sekiro or Elden Ring without Dark Souls 3. What needs to be mentioned is that the lack of depth in the combat is not the same thing as the lack of depth in the variety of options at your disposal, so don't get them confused. The astonishing amount of weapons and magic at your disposal is still impressive to this day and goes a long way when it comes to replayability. Every weapon class feels distinct from one another, and miracles distinguish themselves from sorceries and pyromancies the same way a popular YouTuber doesn't from a predator. If you subscribe now and like the video, I promise you I will do the bare minimum and not interact with any miner. Thank you. The game is balanced more towards melee builds, and in my opinion, that playstyle offers the most enjoyment out of any Souls game, but that doesn't mean that magic is not a viable and fun option. I found pyromancies to be really satisfying, and I think it's the best class of spells for a beginner to start getting comfortable using magic, and miracles kinda break the game as most enemies are weak to lightning. The arsenal brings back classics from both DS1 and DS2 such as Smo's Hammer and Fume Knight's Ultra Greatsword, as well as bringing new unique options to the table such as the dual katanas Onikiri and Ubadachi or the Ring Knight Ultra Greatswords. You cannot tell me these are not fucking epic. The Great Souls also offer us an incredible selection of boss weapons where one is more overpowered than the other. In spite of the impressive armament, rather than any of the various weapons and spells available to the player, I believe that the roll is actually the most important tool, with the improvements made from its previous iterations adding even more to the fluidity of the dance. With DS3, FromSoftware went back to its roots with no bullshit skill required to level up in order to add more iframes. I'm looking at you, Dark Souls 2, whilst also being able to roll in any direction while locking on. I'm looking at you, Dark Souls 1. So just like Hannah Montana, you get the best from both worlds. Add to that a generous sprinkle of extra iframes and a quick recharging timer and you have the best roll in the series. With this design choice, FromSoftware was able to create an even more complex enemy design due to how powerful the roll is. This is how the game is balanced around it. Despite of how spammable the roll is, you still cannot start panic dodging every attack without being punished, as the aggressive nature of the combat was designed around this change. This way you are incentivized to be more aggressive and go for the hit because you know the roll is always available if you have the stamina. It is not Bloodborne level aggressiveness, but it is the peak of action when it comes to the Souls trilogy. The third installment in the series pushes the player the most towards adapting to a role-focused playstyle, but that doesn't mean the shields have lost their purpose and place in the game. Quite the contrary, with these big slabs of metal, concrete and wood that the player can use to roleplay as a fucking door and bully bosses as well as other players. Dark Souls 3 manages to perfectly combine a simple yet effective offensive with a free-flowing defensive to create a tango so well refined that works so well because of the partners you have the pleasure of sharing the stage with. As I previously mentioned, there seems to be a general consensus that Dark Souls 3 has the best bosses FromSoftware has to offer. Opinion which I not only wholeheartedly agree with, but I believe it to be the main selling point of the game in a post-Sekiro and Elden Ring world. What I'm not going to do is claim that every fight in Dark Souls 3 is a masterpiece because I'm not an insane person. Not that insane anyway. But the word consistency is key in this case. The level of quality in the bosses presented to us dips here and there, but does not drop down as low as some iconic faces from the past, such as Pinwheel, Bed of Chaos or the Cavernous Demon, maintaining a consistent level of refinement that highly ramps up towards the end of the game as well as the DLC. The lows are not as low as the series has seen, but the highs have never been surpassed yet. The best way to showcase the quality of the roster is to take you on a Disney ride and illustrate the good, the bad and the ugly of Dark Souls 3's bosses. If anyone somehow didn't figure out that this retrospective is spoiler heavy, I would advise everyone that hasn't experienced this masterpiece yet to have their first playthrough pristine and unspoiled and come back after that.
Oh, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening and good night.
Now if you're still here, let's start with tutorial greatness, Iudex Gandir, which is without a doubt the best tutorial boss Miyazaki has given us. Now for a veteran of the series, Gandir ain't shit. However, for an initiate, Gandir is the best teacher you can ask for. Whilst Demon Souls, Sekiro and Elden Ring fuck around with the tutorial boss with the gimmick of oh you're supposed to die cause you ain't shit yet, Iudex Gandir blocks the entry to the actual game until you beat him. Whilst the Asylum Demon teaches the player to not pick fights you are not ready for yet, which Dark Souls 3 does with a basic enemy, as well as the power of the plunge attack, which is used only one time for a boss after this. Gandir teaches the player all the mechanics they need to use in order to achieve victory through exposure therapy. By having the tutorial boss have more than 2 attacks as well as a second phase that completely changes his moveset, the player is forced to learn, adapt and overcome at a fast pace, getting prepared for harder challenges. If only he was scaled for late game. Gandir is such a perfect tutorial boss that I actually recommend any newcomer to start the series with Dark Souls 3 because of how well the main mechanics are taught in the tutorial. Also notice how I didn't have the parallel with Dark Souls 2, that's because the tutorial doesn't have a boss. Some players quit the game before getting to the last giant, which is whatever and not a tutorial boss. Moving past the tutorial, this is where the dips in quality start happening. Not including the dancer as an early game boss, Vort is kinda mid, okay at best, followed by the awful cursed tree fight with his disgusting ball sacks, the annoying Crystal Sage with his cloning jutsu, and the disappointing Deacons of the Deep that give you the Astro World experience at the end of what is actually a peak level. that is the Cathedral of the Deep. It might seem contradictory how I hyped up the bosses just to start the rotation with a disappointing lineup. Well, have a little patience, because Dark Souls 3 takes the opposite approach of Dark Souls 1, as the second half creates a snowball effect in the quality of the fights instead of making you want to quit playing. After Farron Keep, which is arguably the worst area of the game, we somehow get one of the best bosses in the series, thematically and mechanically, that constitutes the first difficulty spike. The Abyss Watchers have a unique take on the infamous gang fight by giving the player a buddy that can help by distracting the boss or actually get in the way and damage the player instead, as his attacks can actually hurt you. The skill in this fight comes from managing the boss, his goon and your minion, whilst enjoying an astounding piece of music and having artorious flashbacks. A low point always comes after a high one, because after you defeat the Abyss Watchers you get the final dip in quality, as the next boss, Volnir, is the worst boss in the game with his cringe ass bracelets that constitute his health bar, as RNG is the name of the game in this fight, because depending on what he chooses to do, this can either be a walk in the park or the most tedious try not to get gassed challenge. Afterwards, if you want to delay your progression, you can take a trip down memory lane by going to what's left of Lost Izalith and fight Old Demon King, which is... Anyway, Irithil. Dungeon. You have Yorm, which is a cool gimmick fight that is superior to the Storm King, but has been outclassed by Rykard mechanically, however, not thematically. Aspect which I will further elaborate in the story section of the video. If you include the optional areas in the game, I count Irithil as the halfway mark, and this is where Dark Souls 3 starts pulling out the big guns.
Are you ready?
Meet original Relana, aka the big bad roadblock of the game, Pontiff piece of shit Sullivan, Jedi Master and cloning enthusiast. This guy is as much of a bastard in game as he is in the lore. Enjoying an Orlando nostalgia? You think you're fighting ONS? Nah, here's Aldrich, who ate the most hated fanboy in the series, Gwendolyn, just to use his bow against you and him as a flashlight. Boom, teleportation. You're back at Lothric, old lady dies. What the fuck is that? That's the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, the closest thing there is to a sexy Beyblade. Would smash. As the dragons, you get the Dragon Slayer armor, which is not the actual boss. As the name states, you're fighting a suit of armor controlled by that moonlight butterfly bastard in the sky. Nonetheless, amazing fight. You think you're done with peak shit? Nah, Lothric motherfucker. Technically you're fighting Lorien first, then Lothric motherfucker. What's that? A teleporting boss with a giant sword, carrying a magic casting fanboy on his back that is not overtuned, telegraphs his attacks well and creates a satisfying rhythm to the fight? Learn from your predecessors, Radahn, you fucking cunt. Am I moving too fast? I think I missed a couple of bosses. Oh yeah, after the dancer, go left and admire the ugliest dragon you have ever seen in your life that is obsessed with that one guy from Metal Gear Solid. Remember that DS2 energy I was talking about earlier? Yeah, we're somehow back in Firelink Shrine, and we also somehow travel back in time, just at the right moment to get our shit rocked by Prime Gundyr, having the cliche of fighting a harder version of a previous boss beautifully executed as Gundyr ramps up the aggression. Radahn, you didn't learn shit, you cunt. Now, if you have the intuition of Charles Xavier, you might figure out that you can use this random emote that you just found in this spot you probably forgot about or missed in the first place back in Irithil Dungeon to get to the dragon level. Chilling up here to greet you is the Ancient Wyvern, which is an unexpected low point for the amazing streak of peak bosses we've had so far. The catch here is that you're not supposed to fight the Wyvern directly, but actually face a gauntlet filled with annoying snake cunts that ends with you either pulling the sickest plunge attack in the series or the funniest nosedive, so the boss gets a cool point for this. Don't worry about the Wyvern being everything this area has to offer, because Miyazaki would obviously place the hardest boss in the game in an optional late game area, unless of course we're talking about Sekiro or Shadow of the Erdtree. Meet the last son of Plin Gwyn Plon from the end of Dark Souls 1, the Nameless King. Only him can start the fight riding a fucking dragon and somehow have more aura in the second phase when he is by himself. This guy is the godfather of the delayed attacks that will later plague Elden Ring. However, the level of delay is still respectable here and adds to the challenge of the fight alongside his big health and high damage, creating what is the peak endurance fight the base game of DS3 has to offer. That being said, with the gauntlet of bosses concluded, I think now is the perfect time to take a detour to the DLC, as I want to save the final boss for the final chapter, and when it comes to peak boss design, the DLC of Dark Souls 3 upped the level to such a high point the series has yet to reach these heights again. Starting with the elephant in the room, the DLC feels like an expansion that was cut and sold separately to justify pre-ordering the season pass. The amount of content in Ashes of Ariandel is almost disrespectful, and the Ring City feels incomplete without the first third that is Ashes, despite the amazing content that is delivered. I don't know, nor do I care if this was Bandai Namco or FromSoft, but the decision to split these two pieces of content was a poor choice that left people starved for content after finishing Ashes as soon as it dropped back in 2016. That being said, in the present this is not that big of an issue, but criticisms for shady business practices is always required. Looking at the bigger picture, the DLC shines when it comes to adding beautiful locations, expanding the arsenal of weapons with new cool shit, showcasing peak boss design and enriching the lore. So basically it improves everything from the base game. When it comes to locations, after getting sucked into a piece of cloth by a hobo, we start the adventure in the painted world of Ariandel as an obvious throwback to DS1, only this time instead of a fortress, we get a stunning landscape consisting of snowy forests with a dense population of wolves and barbarians, a bird village as opposite to the fish village from Bloodborne, and a church filled with disgusting flies guarded by Freddy Krueger and Corpse Husband. I swear to God, Wilhelm is such a cool NPC. I wanna dress like this motherfucker on my wedding day. If only I had that voice.
Well, you look to be unkindled.
On the boss department, we got a disappointing NPC fight that is also a throwback to the Sith fight from Dark Souls 1, but inferior in all departments. The only cool thing about this fight is the arena, but it feels like wasted potential at the end of the day. Every man wants a sick duel in a field of flowers. Thank you, German and Ishin. The one redeeming aspect of Ashes is by far Frida. The boss fight is so good it almost makes up for the lack of content, doing what DS3 does best, that is referencing the past installments through nostalgic reimaginations of iconic moments that respect the original vision whilst also improving the concept. Besides Sif, Frida is an upgraded version of Priscilla. The feet are still here, baby. Frida takes the invisibility aspect and cranks it up by giving the player subtle snow indicators as well as audio hints in order to figure out where she is before she lands a devastating attack. Phase 2 brings out Daddy Ariandel and turns the fight into a 2 versus 1, balanced by Frida becoming a healing support for her deranged father, and the focus of the fight shifts to alternating between targets as they share a single health bar. And that's it. To be honest, the spectacle of the fight makes the boss more memorable than the actual difficulty, and yeah, I'm just kidding. This is the first 3-phase boss fight in the Soul series. To say I was shocked when I first saw the bitch get back up is an understatement, especially after the game tricks you by giving you a reward after the second phase. To add insult to injury, if the fight was only the third phase, I still think it would be considered a hard fight because Frida goes full Shadow Sonic and just tears the place up with new combos that feel like they never end. The first time I beat Frida, I had the help of Gale, the hobo that got you in here in the first place, and boy am I glad he's an NPC that you can actually count on being on your side. After you raise up to the challenge and finally beat Frida, Ashes of Ariandel is done, and back in 2016 you felt that all of this is a preview for something larger. And that something larger is the iconic Ring City. I say iconic because every time I try to think of a location that oozes the essence of Souls when you stare at an image of it, I personally think of the Ring City, and maybe on Orlando. What adds to the hype is that we get a build up before the reveal of the actual city with the area before it that you can access right after Frida or right before the final boss of the base game. I love that they decided to start the DLC here, as this area was visually striking, but we only got to see it from far away in the main story. That being said, they placed a fucking poison swamp here. Why? Because Miyazaki, that's why. There are also moonlight angel butterflies bitches that will constantly bombard you and can only be killed if you destroy their cocoon shit. Point for an interesting addition. Follow the path marked by the definitely good guy from before, Gale. You satisfyingly defy gravity and fall your way down the map to face off the best duo fight in a FromSoftware game so far. Yes, even better than ONS. The two demons of hatred and from below execute the formula of a gang fight perfectly. Unlike the foreskin duo, one is aggressive that constantly rushes down the player, while the other one focuses on range attacks that are beautifully telegraphed with his trail. You see this shit, gargoyles? You didn't learn shit either. Adding more sauce to the fight is the fact that they periodically switch forms and alternate between range and melee, adding to the challenge when the melee stance overlays for both. What makes this fight complete is the crescendo after you kill both of them and the demon prince shows up. Big health, massive attacks, and depending which demon you killed first, DP gets a big laser or a firestorm as an ultimate ability. Hey look, it's the OG Firelink Shrine, RIP. 3 bosses into the DLC and 2 of them are over everything in the series so far. That's what I call good start, and don't worry, it gets better. After finally arriving to the Ring City, you take a breather to admire the gorgeous and iconic scenery just to immediately gain a core memory getting the John Marston treatment from these ghost archers. Whilst the city itself is not on the scale of Leyndell, it is charming to walk the linear streets filled with the sickest looking, most badass knights I have ever seen in a video game ever. For real, the Ring City knights are the definition of aura, especially this guy. There are also cleric turtle people that are uniquely interesting and annoying at the same time by not allowing you to stand in one place. Also, fuck the curse dudes. Now, if you ignore the second swamp in the last 20 minutes as well as the Elden Ring treatment of Dragon Slayer armor, we meet the imposing dragon Midir, with whom we have a legendary clash on top of a bridge with no health bar in sight. If you are left wanting more after banishing Midir to the abyss, don't sweat, as the first official boss fight in the actual Ring City is next, and it is another NPC fight. Now, being the devil's advocate, I have to admit that I unironically enjoyed this fight, and I think it is the best NPC fight in the series with a huge asterisk. If you fight Half-Light, the boss sucks, cannot defend it. However, if you actually fight another player, this has the potential of being amazing, because yes, this is the old monk from Demon Souls done way better. Another player, part of a special covenant, can join and be the boss. What makes this boss interesting than a regular invade is that the boss gets these painting guardians that act as the main healing method as their flasks are disabled. The fight is even more fun when you are the boss, because depending on your build, you can be a bully and gatekeep the final boss from other players. Is it a dice roll if you actually get a cool fight out of this? Yes. Is it the best NPC fight in the series? Also yes. That says a lot about NPC fights in general. Avoiding yet again the final boss to build suspense, let's talk about the actual fight with Midir, which you can access by following this obvious path that you definitely don't need a guide for. Midir is, in my opinion, still not only the best dragon fight in a FromSoftware game, but in any game I have ever played, period. I'm sorry, Bale. The boss fight is a combination of all the elements that create a masterpiece. Imposing nature, spectacle, endurance, pressure. Midir makes you feel like you're in one of those pictures that show the size difference between a knight and a behemoth. You feel like an insect taking on, well, a fucking dragon. Despite his size, Midir is fast and unrelenting with his attacks, going full Godzilla with lasers later on in the fight. The large health makes this a battle of attrition where you hope you don't run out of flasks too fast. Despite everything, what I think makes the fight work so good is how the player is pushed to go for the head. Souls players are used to stick to that ass or hide between the legs when it comes to dragon fights or big monsters in general, but with Midir, the puny damage that you do by hitting his legs or tail pushes you to time your attacks and exclusively go for the head, creating a legendary stare down while you wait for the opportunity to strike. Through this gameplay decision, the camera also doesn't have a stroke like with Bale. You would think that after all this glazing it doesn't get better than Midir, but boy are you wrong. Midir is just the best side dish you'll ever consume. However, dinner always ends with a dessert, and nothing concludes a better dinner than a perfect dessert. I promise I don't want to make a habit out of teasing you, but as I'm approaching the end of the video as well as the end of the game, I need to change focus to the story of Dark Souls 3 as it symbolically represents an ending. An ending to everything. Important thing to mention is that when I talk about the story, I'm not talking about the lore, as we already have a guy for that and he's the perfect man for the job. When I talk about the story, I'm talking about the narrative and the themes that surround it. While the narrative is simple and straightforward, replicating the one from DS1, the themes of desperation, nihilism, and also hope give the story its depth in the context of an imminent ending. Once again, the fire is fading. You wake up and your task is to link said fire. Only this time, you are the Ashen One and not the Chosen Undead. The difference being is that you are not the Chosen One this time, as others were called upon to do this job already. Lothric was the chosen one to link the fire, but he refused. Aldrich, the Abyss Watchers, and Yorm came back from the dead, called to link the fire again, but they also refused. That's where you come into play, forcing these fallen lords to do their job. But then you start asking yourself questions. Why should I do this when others much greater than me refused? What's the point of linking the fire over and over again if nothing changes? Should I let everything fade, wishing for a new world to begin from darkness? Should I kill my... The story of DS3 is about grasping the concept of ending. This can be observed through the lens of other NPCs that are connected to the main story. Hawkwood lost hope and deserted his fellow undead legionnaires just to pursue his own ambitions of becoming a dragon. Anri of Astora has their goal of defeating Aldrich set in stone, and not even the loss of their most trusted companion Horus would stray them from this path. And Sigvard of Cararina pledged to his friend that he will put him out of his misery. Sigvard is my favorite NPC in the Soul series, as he always fills you up with hope, joy, and Zigbrau with every encounter. That is, before you get reminded that onions do make you cry.
Yom, old friend.
This cutscene at the end of Sigvard's questline makes a gimmick fight stand out through the tragedy of an Onion Knight putting his friend out of his misery with the weapon he gifted him. Duty, purpose, promise. These are parallels that highlight the different motivations of people facing the same ending. When the fire is fading, the world is crumbling, and the people are losing it, would you see your task to the end, or would you lose your identity and go hollow? Like this guy, Lap, or should I say Patches. Talk about someone who was there from the beginning and lasted until the very end, going through the spider phase as well. At the end of everything, Patches has lost his memory, therefore his identity, and clings to whatever purpose he had before he forgot about it. You almost feel bad for the guy that fucked you over twice in the same game. Therefore, you help him recover what he lost just so that he can fuck you over again and push you over the ledge one last time. Only this time, he pushes you in the right direction. Patches is a point of reference for someone whose nature is stronger than time itself, unaffected by most, influenced by few. Greyrat is so pure even Patches fucks with him. Don't do his questline, please. At the end, once every Lord of Cinder has been gathered, there is only one final challenge standing in the way of you and the fading fire, the Soul of Cinder. When it comes to dramatic showdowns, Soul of Cinder is the textbook definition. Everything you have learned so far is put to the test as the boss alternates between stances, from the classic straight sword to spears, curved swords, sorceries, pyromancies, and even poison. The boss throws everything at you, and all you have to do is gather the knowledge you have accumulated and use it against them. Once the second phase hits and you hear the plim plim plon while getting pummeled into the ground by familiar attacks, not only do you realize you're fighting Gwen, you're fighting every undead that has ever lit the fire. You're up against your previous playthroughs as well as every other chosen undead out there, making this the emotional climax that the game deserves before the credits roll. With the soul of Cinder defeated, there is nothing left but to make a choice. Will you link the fire once more and repeat the cycle? Or will you let the world succumb to darkness and rebuild a new one from the shadow? There is no right answer, there is no good ending. Unless you kill the firekeeper, then you're a bastard. Your decision is valid as it concludes your own experience. Me personally, I like the everything everywhere all at once frame of mind that is anti-nihilism. Nothing really matters, therefore everything matters. That's why I just link the fire, knowing that it will eventually fade, but I'm not letting go of the hope regarding the uncertainty of the future. But what happens after the fire actually fades? What happens even after that? What happens after the darkness fades? What happens at the end of everything? Gale happens. I think it's fitting that I saved the battle at the end of everything for the end of this retrospective, because I wholeheartedly believe that Gale is the best boss I have ever fought in a video game, as I continuously search for the high that I got when I first faced him, just to come back to Dark Souls 3 because nothing else comes remotely close. If you ever need a reason to play or replay DS3, Gale is your reason. I fully own up to the glazing. It is that good. Gale is what you get when you get inspired by works such as Breaking Bad, Uncharted, God of War, and BoJack Horseman, and internalize the importance of the conclusion. Following his trail all throughout the DLC, at the end of time and space, here lies a deranged yet sane Gale, focused on his sole task of getting your Dark Soul. Maybe the Dark Soul were actually the friends we made along the way. In a series where we have two hunters fighting to save each other from the dream they're stuck in, and an unkillable samurai trying to sever immortality, fighting his also immortal enemy only for him to summon his grandfather in his peak era in order to save his country, it is a bit poetic that two nobodies fighting for what is practically nothing at the end of everything takes the cake when it comes to epic thematic battles. After a notorious callback, the fight starts with Gale in a beast-like state where his aggressive nature will surprise the player. Fast combos, delayed attacks, and constant pressure are key characteristics of this phase, just so we can have a total switch up a third way into the fight when Gale regains some of his humanity and start fighting more like a warrior than a beast. Warrior boss fights have always been the best in the series. I don't want to hear any complaint about that. Using everything at his disposal, such as a crossbow with a switch, magic, and his cape that is more deadly than his actual sword as it extends his combos, Gale pushes you to do the same and unleash everything you have at him. In a dramatic fashion, the third leg of the fight stands out through the lightning coming down from the sky to create a tense build-up to the crescendo of finally overcoming this grueling foe. The description of this fight doesn't do it enough justice, as you have to go through it to actually experience the best dance in the Soul series. Having defeated Gale, you collect his Dark Soul and respect his last wish by giving the pigment to the lady in the painting for her to create a new world that would last beyond the ending of this one. After all, hope is the thing that lasts beyond the end of everything, the same way hope was the remaining thing at the bottom of Pandora's box. That's how Dark Souls 3 concludes, and with that, the legendary trilogy finally comes to a satisfying end. The good and the bad memories come together to create a painting that would remain with the player forever. The world, the gameplay loop, the progression, the music, the voice acting, the writing, the level design, the bosses, the world building, and I can keep going on. All of these elements come together effortlessly to create this masterpiece. That being said, Dark Souls 3 is not a perfect game and it has its flaws. However, doing the most with its resources, Dark Souls 3 delivers a refined final product filled with surprises, and despite having the pressure of being the culmination of a classic trilogy and franchise, it delivers a perfect finale as well as a comprehensive introduction to the series and the genre, ending and restarting the cycle in a thematic fashion. After staring at the credits, listening to the masterpiece of a soundtrack, you remember the feeling I was talking about at the beginning of the video, and you start to wonder about what should you do with your life now. But you also remember that at the end of everything, there is hope for a new world to flourish.